Okay, so we're going to talk about the early church and slavery. What is the issue here? The issue is that the church is accused of failing to condemn slavery until very, very late. I've even read that from one critic that it didn't condemn slavery until 1870. And also that not only did it not condemn slavery, but that it also owned slaves. And so, and since we all know that slavery is such a terrible evil, then how is this possible? How can the church pretend to be the one true church if it condoned the slavery? And how can it possibly, and it's changed its teaching. There at one time it said slavery was okay, and now it's saying that slavery is is immoral, and so the church has changed its position. This is a famous, one famous critic who's written a book on this, A Church That Can and Cannot Change, and he uses this as one of his examples. So to begin with, I'm just going to make two little distinctions here. The first one is between different kinds of slavery. Okay, one of them is called chattel slavery, and it means that the owner owns the slave, and the slave has no rights at all. So he owns the person of the slave, and the slave has absolutely no rights. Where this is distinct from what you might call a slavery where the owner of the slave has a right to his work, but has to respect the human dignity or the human rights of the slave. So that's one distinction that we're going to get into. Another one is a distinction between what's called just title servitude and illicit or immoral slavery. And this would depend on how the slave became a slave, whether it was by a free man who was taken by violence, or whether he became a slave because he sold himself into slavery, or was condemned to slavery by a court for some serious crime that he committed. So just to put that out for the moment, we'll get back to it. The church was born, as we've said several times already, in the Roman Empire, and we'll begin by looking at slavery as it existed in the Roman Empire when the church when the church was born. In the Roman Empire, under Roman law, a slave was totally owned by his owner, by his master. He or she was not considered to be a person with any rights whatsoever. The owner had total arbitrary power over the slave. The slave could be sold, and he couldn't object to that. The owner could have a slave put to death, and he didn't need any justification. He could order the slave to be executed, he would be executed. He could order the slave to be tortured or punished, and he didn't need any justification for that either. The slave could be tortured, put to death, sold. The slave had absolutely no rights. And in the Roman law, the slave is classed together with cattle and oxen. It's just another chattel, it's called, another piece of, another possession of the owner. The owner also could exploit or use his slave or her slave sexually. So he could take advantage of the slave sexually, and he could also put the slave, young boys or women, out to prostitution and obtain the results from that, and the slave again had no choice but to give in to that. The slave could also be mutilated, branded, castrated, whatever. Again, there was no total power, and there was absolutely the slave had no rights. It's like a cattle or some cattle or an oxen. There was nothing, under Roman law, there were no rights whatsoever. The owner controlled reproduction. If he wanted a slave to bear children, and the children of a female slave would be slaves, so they did do this. In fact, after the 1st century AD, the biggest source of slaves were children of slaves. Then he was the one who controlled the reproduction. He's the one who would see who would have sexual relations with the slave in order to obtain children. It could be himself or another slave or anyone whom he designated. The slave had no legal family. His mother was known, but the father was not known. But in any event, there was the mother had no rights over the child. Once the child was born, she might be given the task of taking care of him or her, or might not be. And the young slave could be sold at any time without the mother being able to object. The Roman Empire was a slave society and a slave economy. They've done some figures are known. In the last half of the 1st century BC, there were an average of 100,000 new slaves being imported into Italy every year. And by the time of, in the second half of in the 1st century AD, for the empire as a whole, it's calculated that there were 500,000 new slaves every year coming into the empire. As I say, in the 1st century BC, these were mainly from military conquests. They were prisoners of war, but as we enter into AD, a large part of that comes from children of slaves. There were 2 million to 3 million slaves in Italy. 35% of the population were slaves, which comes from about 2 to 3 million slaves in Italy. Italy was the place in the empire where there were most slaves. There were also slaves throughout the empire, but the biggest concentration was in Italy. They came from military conquest, children of slaves, also exposed infants. As I was saying earlier today, usually female babies were put out, were exposed by their father when, if they weren't wanted, which was the greatest number of cases. Now, slave traders knew this, and they knew where these babies would go to be exposed, so they would pick them up and then raise them and then sell them as slaves after some years. So that was a big, also another important source of slaves. Piracy and trade. The Romans used to purchase slaves, or slave traders used to purchase slaves from pirates, and then they would resell them on the Roman slave markets. They played an important economic role. They worked in the mines, they worked on the farms. The lot of a slave would vary a lot depending on where he was working. If he was working in one of these mines in Sicily or in Spain, then his life expectancy might be only a number of weeks. Whereas other slaves, they might, if they worked in a household in Rome as a tutor to the child, if they were educated, or as a personal helper to their master, they might have a fairly decent life. And so it really varied a lot. You didn't want to be working in a mine as a Roman slave. They also played an important social and cultural role. It was a measure of status, how many slaves you had, and how many, so that was if you could name, I have 5,000 slaves, I have 10,000 slaves, then that made you give you a higher social status than someone who had fewer. And one of the great, one thing that happened a lot was that owners would free slaves in their will. So they would free perhaps 10,000 or 20,000 slaves in their will to show how magnanimous they were or how rich they were. Were slaves freed? Yeah, some of them were, but not the majority. So you can say that it looks like maybe perhaps 30% of slaves were freed eventually. Men usually at the age of around 30, and women at around the age of 40, after they were no longer able to bear children. The reason for that was that the master would hold out this promise to them in order to get them to work better. In other words, if you work well, I will free you. They weren't under any obligation to do that. A contract was not binding, but of course other slaves would see this, and so if he kept his promise to one, then the other ones would work harder, because one of the big problems with slavery is that the slave is not motivated to work, so you have to find some motivation for him. There's the carrot and the stick being the whip, but the punishment. But it was found that holding out the promise of manumission, it was called, of being freed, was a good incentive. Now, this is the situation into which Christianity was born. The Old Testament had allowed slavery. It was a kinder version. If you read in Deuteronomy or Numbers, the Pentateuch, even though the slave was considered property, he was really considered a member of the household. He had to be freed after 7 years, was the law of the Old Testament, and he was considered to be part of the family. He was not supposed to be mistreated. Again and again, you have this injunction from God to the Israelites saying, remember, you were slaves in Egypt, so you have to treat your own slaves well. And so there's that indication.